We've been looking at fruits of the Spirit, and today we're going to talk about prophecy. Pastor Kildy is with me, who has been kind of leading us. I'm standing in for Pastor Athena today, actually. I'm not Pastor Athena, as is obvious to you who are watching. If you're watching at home, we welcome you as well. Let's start with a prayer. Good and gracious God, you've given so many gifts of the Spirit that help us to live a God-fearing life. Today, Lord, we will lift up the gift of prophecy, and we thank you for all the prophets through time, from the Old Testament times to the New Testament times to the time after, to even modern-day prophets such as Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and people we are particularly remembering during this Black History Month. Be with us now and bless us always in our discussions and our conversation. We pray this in Jesus' name. Let the people of God say, Amen. Pastor Kildy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. And welcome again to all of you here in the room and those of you who are sitting in on this class online this morning. We're delighted to have you. We've been talking about gifts of the Spirit, and we've been talking about the rather amazing variety of those gifts and how people of all kinds and abilities are gifted in some way, and all of those gifts are really important to the whole. We've also been reminded, and in some ways in a sort of surprising way, that most of these gifts are to be exercised not in rooms like this, but out where people are and in the rest of the world. Today, we're talking about a gift that I think in many ways is one of the toughest, and that's the gift of prophecy. In 1965, I was at Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I was president of the student congregation. It was kind of a wild time in America, maybe not so different than right now. We had raging issues going on around the Vietnam War and around race, and our congregation decided we would have a debate about the war. And so we wanted to be very even-handed, and so we invited someone from the American Friends Service Committee, Quaker folk, to take the side of being against the war. And we invited a person we thought was our resident hawk, the poli-sci prof at Augie, to take the other side of the debate. Well, it turned out the debate was kind of a dud. The Quaker took the pacifist position as we expected, and our hawk, who had been in the State Department back at the end of World War II, quoted General MacArthur at great length about how dumb and strategically disastrous it would be to go to war in Indochina. So the debate didn't amount to much. But I had to take this gentleman back to an airport about an hour and a half away from school to make his connection back to New York. And on the way, he asked me what I was going to do with my life. And I said I felt called to be a pastor. And I was startled at his response. He looked at me and said, "So what else are you going to do?" Now, my dad was a pastor, and I had watched him all my years growing up, and I thought, being a pastor is kind of a full-time job. But this gentleman then repeated his comment, "What else are you going to do?" And he said, we could staff the American Friends Service Committee many times over with highly qualified pastors who were unemployable in their denominations because they got fired for speaking prophetic truth with power in their congregations. And he proceeded to tell me stories, largely around the issue of race at that time. Prophecy, speaking truth, being loyal to what the Bible says about our role in the world can be really difficult. We don't like to hear it if we're on the receiving end, and being called to proclaim it is not always so easy either. I want to just touch briefly on a few examples. In Old Testament times, there's that incredible encounter between David and the prophet Nathan, when Nathan stands before the king and calls him to account for his actions around Bathsheba. We have numerous instances where prophets speaking truth to power pay a tremendous price. We know, for example, in the New Testament that John the Baptist ends up losing his head, largely because of his criticism of the actions of the king, King Herod. The topics are very, very old. They have to do with justice and mercy and equality and looking out for the poor and all the rest. And the prophets are particularly difficult on those people who see themselves as very, very religious and do religious things, but ignore the things that God tells them to do. I'm going to share two brief quotes. From Amos, who was not usually very politically correct, here's what he says in the 5th chapter. I hate and despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings, I will not accept them. The offerings of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. And then these words, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. It's not very uncommon for people to think of prophets as primarily sort of religious fortune tellers. But in fact, they were teachers of righteousness. They were called to proclaim the will of God for those who follow God in the world. Another famous quote comes from the prophet Micah. Micah talks about how the Israelites are ignoring the poor and ignoring the widows and the orphans and the strangers. And he has a message similar to Amos. And he ends with these famous words, He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with God. And of course, we have Jesus' words in Matthew 23 and other places, but there particularly where he speaks about the scribes and the Pharisees who loved to talk about how religious they were, loved to judge people, but were unwilling to lift a finger to help. All of this is to say that these are very, very old themes. And since the very beginning of our record of God's interaction with us, we are challenged to look after our neighbor. We're challenged to speak out for those who are disadvantaged or poor or oppressed in some kind of way. And over, we see that Jesus calls us to do justice and mercy in the world. And so, with that, we are very pleased today to have with us Devin from a vehicle through which we, along with many other folks in our community, are working to do just the things I've been talking about. Pastor Wolfgang.
All right. I have the honor and privilege to introduce Devin a little bit to you and to tell you just in 2 sentences what our involvement has been in One Wake. One Wake is a community organization made up of almost 50 congregations, temples, and mosques that's concerned about justice in Wake County and that is engaging in the areas of affordable housing, education, and jobs. Christ the King has been part of that since the beginning. When I first came back in 2016, it had just begun, and there was a bunch of pastors meeting on a regular basis trying to build this organization. And here we are 5 years later, and we will hear more about what One Wake is doing. It's a very important part of our mission and ministry. Here at Christ the King, we have a very active A-team, as you know, advocacy team, and they do lots of stuff, and this is an important part of that. So I'm very pleased to introduce the lead organizer for One Wake, who's been with the organization from the beginning, Devin Ross. Devin, thanks so much for being here.
All right, let's see if I can over the course of this, figure out exactly the right way to hold this microphone. So I'm going to look to everybody here to give me a little help if I fade out or you can't hear me, just shout at me and I'll fix whatever I'm doing wrong. So again, I'm Devin Ross. I'm the lead organizer for One Wake. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've been called on to lead some thinking and some reflection about prophecy, One Wake, this ministry of your church, and how One Wake can serve as a vehicle through which Christ the King can act to see your values, your mission, and what matters to you represented in the outside world. I think the way I'd like to do this is I'd be glad to introduce myself, One Wake, share a little bit of thinking about how this organization can be a vehicle for prophecy. Then maybe I could pause for a bit and get your reactions, questions, and we can kind of see where the energy is and follow it through our time together this morning. Yeah. Does that sound all right to everybody? Okay. Good. So when I was thinking about this and when I was preparing this morning, I thought it would really be interesting to lift up not only the importance of prophecy, but the importance of speaking truth with power, and the dangers of speaking truth without power, and to explore those two ideas a little bit more closely together. So let's see if you find that interesting, and we'll see if my assumption this morning was correct or not. First, just a little bit about me. So I've been with One Wake for going on about 2 years now. I've been in this role as a professional organizer for 6 years before that, working for One Wake's sister organization in Orange County, just on the other side of Durham. I'd say, speaking more broadly, throughout my entire life, I've been driven by the desire, the urge, the appetite to make change in the world around me. Because at key points in my life, it became very clear to me that the world as it is today didn't reflect my own values, the values of my own religious tradition, or how my parents taught me to think about the world around me, or what to expect from the world around me. One example of this comes from time I spent in Chicago before I moved to North Carolina. I was in Chicago for about 3 years, spending most of my time working right on the front lines of the foreclosure crisis. This was 2007, 2008 in the Rogers Park neighborhood of Chicago, which, if you've never been there, is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the entire country. It's like Queens, like parts of LA. It's a port of entry for immigrants from all over the world. 40 different languages are spoken in this one neighborhood area. It's a truly special neighborhood and a community that has a history of being organized. Block by block, you can see testament to citizens past and present and what they've managed to build and preserve in this neighborhood. In the early aughts, around 2003, 2004, a lot of community organizations and a lot of community leaders in Rogers Park began to hear some really disturbing things. People they knew, people in their congregations, their neighbors, people they knew socially, were all getting really aggressively targeted by this new breed of brokers that had moved into the neighborhood, opening up storefronts and kind of fly-by-night operations, pushing loans and mortgages to people who had never been sold a mortgage before. People on disability, people without steady incomes, very new immigrants who weren't completely familiar with how our financial system worked here. And all across Rogers Park, families and individuals, households, were getting into debt and were signing papers that they didn't understand for loans that they couldn't possibly repay. What I'm describing, of course, is the lead up to the housing bubble bursting and the foreclosure crisis of 2008 and 2009. But I think unlike the way this crisis is sometimes portrayed in the media, it came as no surprise to the community organizations and leaders in Rogers Park at least, because we saw this problem coming for years, and for years, these organizations were sounding the alarm. How could it be that somebody with no income is getting loaned $500,000 to buy a house that they can't possibly afford? By the time I came around, it was too late. The housing bubble had burst, and thousands of families across a single neighborhood, not to mention the entire city, were suddenly falling behind on their mortgage payments and facing foreclosure. And I spent over 2 years working one-on-one with families and households, trying to help them negotiate some kind of workout plan to keep them in their home, which would often look like them sitting down across the desk from me, putting together a strategy and calling their loan servicer, whoever it was, to ask that they be allowed to stay in their home and to try and restructure their payments in a way that would keep them in their home through the crisis. Well, if you can imagine, that worked out about as well as you might think. I worked with 150 families, more or less, over 2 years. It takes a while to lose your home in Illinois, because it has to go through the courts. I helped 3 families save their house, and I watched everybody else lose everything they had worked their whole lives for. I watched elderly couples drain their retirement accounts and cash in all their assets just to keep up with partial payments on their mortgage, which had gotten away from them. You know, I worked with Nigerian taxi cab drivers. I worked with immigrants from India and Pakistan. I worked with a lot of just regular middle-class residents of this neighborhood who were all looking down the gun of entering their late life with nothing and having to restart at 60, 70, at a time in their life when they should be enjoying their retirement and their grandkids. You know, I had a colleague who at the time said, if only these banks knew, if only they knew what was happening down here, maybe they'd do something different. But what I suspected, and I think what later was borne out to be true, is that you know, these big financial institutions did know what was happening. The problem was we had no way to hold them accountable. And families that had been, you know, marketed these loans, who were losing everything, had no tool by which they could organize themselves and bring you know, some of the largest and most powerful financial institutions to the table with them. We're dealing with Deutsche Bank, you know, Bank of America, Countrywide at the time, some of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. I left this job eventually. I gave 2 months' notice. I moved to North Carolina, and you know, I was really hungry. I had and still do, had a big chip on my shoulder, and I wanted to figure out, you know, how do we act in a situation like this where people we love and the communities we live in are getting acted on or harmed by institutions with so much more power than they have? What do you do in that situation? And eventually, that led me to the particular type of community organizing that One Wake practices. Organizing that focuses first and foremost on the creation, maintenance, and use of nonpartisan power. The very core of our work is a very basic argument, that if you want change, you need power. And power is a word that, for many of us, has a negative connotation. You know, in many ways, power was what I saw being used against members of the Rogers Park neighborhood. But, you know, as I've come to learn and understand, you know, power isn't good or bad. It's a tool, and it's all about how you use it. You can use it to act on a working class neighborhood and take their wealth, or you can use it to protect the futures of low to medium income families in your community. It's very simply organized people and organized money acting consistently and persistently. Like Pastor Wolfgang mentioned, back in 2016, a team of clergy and religious leaders here in Wake County got very interested in this type of organizing and started to ask themselves, you know, what would it look like for us to build an organization that could help us build our power here in Wake County sufficient to the level that we could begin to act with and sit at the table with the big interests that are reshaping our communities. You know, what would it look like if we created a vehicle through which we could aggregate all of our members and all of our resources to create an organization that was big enough and large enough to really address the roots of problems that we see every day in our community around affordable housing, access to good jobs, equity in the education system. And for 4 years, we pre-organized our relationships until in October of 2020, we publicly launched One Wake as a new organization and as a new ministry for close to 50 religious institutions and nonprofits across the county. You know, here we are, relatively young, but you know, but at a time when many of the cities and towns that are represented in this organization are at a critical moment, and in Cary, it's no different. It's interesting to think about the gift of prophecy in the context of Cary. Cary's at a really key moment in its development, which, I mean, anybody here, if you step outside or go down Carytown Boulevard, you can see for yourself this town is changing. There's unprecedented outside investment that's reshaping Cary. The town is growing rapidly. Well, really, I'd say we're at a moment where the town of Cary is going to be forced to or have to change the way it operates to accommodate what it is today. I mean, for one thing, and you know, perhaps I'm not the first person to make this observation, but we live in a city here in Cary that still calls itself a town, right? We have 180,000 people in the town of Cary, and you know, where I come from, 180,000 people, that's a pretty big town. You know, and I speak with all the humility of an outsider here, but it seems like, in many ways, Cary still operates as if it's a town. By that I mean, it seems like a lot of the ways you can make change or get heard in Cary today depends on your personal relationships with town council members or key staff or other decision makers in Cary. Much the way a small town works. You know, in a town of 5,000, 10,000 people, you know, often you'll see more informal relationships in how you know, in how small towns are governed. But the problem is, once you get to 180,000 people, that means that there's a lot of residents, there's a lot of constituencies that just are no longer represented. because of the size and complexity of the community. It calls for a different type of politics that we don't see as much in Cary today. And I think one wake is, depending on how grandiose I want to be, you could say this organization is changing the political culture or attempting to change the political culture here in Cary, or at least is an indicator that the culture is changing from this small town, informal relational politics to the politics of a real city where people and communities have to organize themselves to make sure that their voices are heard and that their interests are at the table for a lot of the key decisions that are being made today. Because without that, without a vehicle for more people to get to the table and to have a voice in the shape of Cary's politics, you're going to see people, especially who traditionally haven't had a lot of power in town, get squeezed and eventually forced out. The top interest, if you knock on doors in working class apartment complexes like the Arbors, or go through the very large mobile home park off of Maynard Mobile Estates, which is also known as Las Americas, the top pressure families are feeling is the astronomically rising cost of housing, the extremely high price to buy in to home ownership in this town, and skyrocketing rents, which are forcing many longtime residents as well as newer arrivals to Cary who perform many of the jobs that keep this town running to move out of town. We heard a rumor that a council member once joked that the town of Cary's affordable housing strategy is Holly Springs. Well, I got news for you. If you go to Holly Springs today, that's not a cheap town either, right? We're at a moment where big developments are coming in to serve people earning over six figures, but there's nothing or very little investment going towards middle class or working class families that have long invested in this town and community and kept this place running. And we're coming to a moment where we have a choice about what we want this town to look like. Do we want Cary to be a gated community? Or do we want it to be a real diverse city where many people can move and thrive regardless of income? The choice is really up to us. The important thing is it's not just about knowing what's happening. It's also about investing in creating the power necessary to address what we see in our communities. In the world as it is today, in our current economic and political and social reality, we see Cary and we see all of Wake County going through an unprecedented economic transformation that benefits some people, but often comes at the cost of the very people who have lived here and made this place such an attractive area for investment in the first place. That's the world as it is today, and left unchecked, in 10 or 20 years, Cary and all of Wake County could turn into, some kind of giant luxury community. And if we want that, that's all right, I guess, but that's what's happening. If we want that to change, if we want to move to the world as it should be, a world that more represents our values that we express in this church and others, we're going to have to organize our people and our power and deliver our congregations in large number very consistently behind a vision of something different. Of course, I didn't come here without some suggestions about what we could do together, but maybe this is a good time for me to pause, get your reactions, and see, is this argument making sense? And what do you think?
Just a second, I'll come to you so that everybody who's outside of the room can hear too.
2 Fridays ago, my Rotary Club meeting, I invited the Cary Chief of Police, and he spoke about a lot of good things, of course. And one of the town council people was there also as a guest. And at some point, I had an opportunity to ask him about affordable housing for our police officers, our firemen, and our teachers, and what's being done to allow these people to be able to live where they work. And he gave a positive answer, but I wasn't sure it was what I was looking for. Also, getting back to like Southeast Raleigh, a year or so ago when there was a force out there that wanted to change that area with the potential sports arena. If you have some time this morning, would you speak a little bit on that, how it went down and what were the forces, opposing forces in that issue, if you have time?
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
So I'd be glad to talk a little bit about our experience working around the issue of the downtown south development in Raleigh. Before I go there, are there any other questions or reactions based on what I've already lifted up? Perhaps a more basic question. Am I making good sense here? Are you worried about where this talk is going? Do you think this guy up here is crazy or lost his mind? There's another one.
So it seems like Cary's at a turning point, and I wonder, what do you think the odds are that we'll be successful in sort of making some change, and are there some examples where that's happened, and there have been some successes?
Yeah, great. All right, good.
I had a little bit of a problem with the analogy and the comparisons between the towns and the cities, because the only difference I see between the towns and the cities is, in the southern towns, they call it the good old boy system. In the cities, they call it patronage. But it all comes out to the same thing.
Other comments for right now?
Okay, great. Well, let me take those maybe in reverse order, and then we'll see where we get. I think when we imagine the world we want to create, we have to start with where we are, and like you pointed out just now, very often if we're in a town, it could look like a good old boy system, or if we're in a city, it could look like a patronage system which works for the benefit of the political elite and the people who follow them, but rarely anybody else. That's often our starting point, and we build organizations like One Wake because we recognize that those issues, it's less about meeting the needs of individuals, and it's more about reorganizing the way that decisions are made and who is listened to in any particular town and community, and that takes power. What are our odds today in helping to bring more voices to the table to shape the future of this town? I think our odds are pretty good. If they weren't, I don't think I'd be here. I think that in Cary, institutions like Christ the King and others, many of whom are participating in One Wake, but not necessarily all, I think that your institution and allied institutions have done quite a lot already to lay the groundwork for this moment. You've developed robust outreach and advocacy programs. You've had conversations within your congregation about the role you want to see this institution play in the outside world. The town of Cary is no stranger to churches and nonprofits already working together to bring change and to address needs in your community. You've laid the groundwork through the Well, Dorcas Ministries, for one, is really a diamond in the crown of civic participation here in Cary. A lot of this work and a lot of this groundwork is already being done. People and their institutions in this town are already interested in organizing themselves for change. And that means that what we're trying to do with One Wake is just one more step forward, building on, decades of careful, steady, and patient relationship building that's already been going on in this town. I think this year, next year, we've got not only a good chance to bring more voices to the table and win public investment in the interests of working and middle-class families. I think we have the ability not only to do that, but to perhaps engage a broader section of this town in local politics that has ever been engaged before. Something we've been talking about a lot over the last year is the moment we're in. Is we're seeing major companies coming to this area now. That is creating a general sense that we need to be very clear on what our priorities are here locally. Apple's moving in just over the border in Morrisville. Big tech is coming to our community. Larger and larger companies are relocating here. And I think what's unique about this moment is that we have pressure now, not only coming from inside of our communities, but also much more substantially from outside. And the opportunity with large companies like Apple and others coming here is that it provides us, the space or the reason to bring the town together to say, what do we as the town of Cary want in this moment where the town could be very well defined by powerful interests and investment, coming from across the country. What do we want the town of Cary to look like, knowing what we know has happened to other towns that have seen this kind of investment, like Austin, Texas for one, or all the communities around Silicon Valley for another. I think we have an external pressure that's so great at this moment that it's perhaps giving us the opportunity for town-wide action and engagement that just hasn't existed in the past, but we'll see. In other words, I think our odds are good.
I wonder if you could address one question for us, because I think that it's possible that not everybody is really clear about this, and that is how and who sets the agenda for the things that One Wake pursues. I think that's quite important.
Yeah. Well, in the largest sense, we all do. So this agenda, our analysis of what's happening in Cary and the issues that we're pursuing as One Wake come from a grassroots listening campaign that has engaged over 3,300 members of our communities, congregations, and surrounding neighborhoods, which led to the organization and leaders representing every institution that participates in the organization to take a vote based on what we've heard about what arenas or what big problems we want to prioritize first. And that was back in 2019. And three priorities emerged. Affordable housing was number one, which isn't a big surprise given how big housing pressure is. Access to good jobs was another. And then there was also interest in exploring equity issues within our education system. Over the last couple of years, in addition to launching this organization, Teams of leaders have been taking those big problems and have been working to shape them into tangible, winnable issues. So we're not trying to solve affordable housing, because good luck with that. But what we are trying to do is, very specifically, win a designated local housing fund in the town of Cary, which is a tool with a track record of helping to create and preserve affordable housing locally. That's been adopted in every major triangle town or city except for Cary. Apex even has one, and they're quite a lot smaller. We're also working on a county-wide property tax issue, which has a base of interest in Southeast Raleigh, but impacts all across Wake County. Especially in gentrifying neighborhoods, the skyrocketing cost of property taxes is now threatening to displace longtime low-income homeowners. We have these issues that are specific, specific issues that are our way to act on what we know to be the priorities without, in a way that leads us towards some kind of tangible change that we can measure, celebrate, and then, move on to the next campaign from. So our people decide, and Christ the King has a voice in the agenda of this organization. We decide through these grassroots campaigns, but then, of course, sometimes the world around us changes, and we have to react in a way that falls outside of our normal organizing cycle. So what happened with the Downtown South development in Raleigh is an example of that. Here we are, as not even an established organization, the summer of 2020. We just figured out how to use Zoom. We're trying to figure out how to launch One Wake still in the fall. And the rector of St. Ambrose Episcopal Church, in a One Wake leaders meeting, brought a concern forward in the mix of that, saying, I've just learned that only a few miles upstream from my church and community, they're planning this 150-acre development that could lead to so much water runoff into Walnut Creek that my church and my neighborhood are going to get flooded off the map. And the neighborhood is Rochester Heights, which was the first African-American neighborhood that was allowed in segregated Raleigh. It's a middle-class neighborhood, and it was a neighborhood that was a point of pride for a lot of black families in Raleigh and greater Wake County, as we've learned from current residents who have history there. So sometimes we have to react. When this concern was brought forward, it was clear that this was something that One Wake could potentially address. We didn't have a lot of time. We had about 6 months until the rezoning hearing for the development. And we knew we were up against a lot, because we were up against the interest of the largest developer, at least in the Triangle, if not locally in North Carolina, John Kane and Kane Realty, in a city, Raleigh, where in many ways development is the primary industry, right? Between developers and all of the ancillary employers, home builders associations, realtors, lawyers. In many ways, we were taking on the economic self-interest of a fairly large group of reasonably powerful people in a city that we were very new to. So we knew that we were compelled to act. We knew that we also were up against a lot of power. And the question was, how much can we win with the power that we have versus how much power we're confronting with this particular campaign? After 6 months of organizing, we held public meetings with Mayor Baldwin and with John Kane. We engaged in probably half a dozen small group negotiations with the city and the developer. We brought, at a minimum, 700 people out across a series of actions in the 6 weeks leading up to the rezoning decision. What we walked away with was a $2.5 million investment from Kane Realty into the Walnut Creek watershed to prevent and mitigate future flooding as a result of runoff from downtown South, which is a significant investment that was for a plan developed by a third-party engineer that we knew and trusted. We felt pretty good about that. We won kind of a much weaker second commitment around affordable housing, which I won't get into the details here on, but was a very small offering given the value of the rezoning for Kane Realty, which, you know, and that's where we left it. There's an interesting coda to that, though. So the rezoning passed on December 15th, 2020, if I'm remembering that right, or December 17th in 2020. But there was a second part to that campaign, which was the creation of a tax increment financing scheme that would provide public subsidy for developments like downtown South in the future. You know, a public subsidy that we believe was developed with the interest of John Kane in mind by the city of Raleigh. The tax increment financing plan was passed by the city in the spring, but partially as an effect of the attention and the public attention that we helped bring onto this development, this fund has not been tapped yet. It's become so politically controversial that so far no developers have stepped forward to request funding because of the extent to which it was made clear that the public, the citizens of Raleigh, were not in favor of using public money to bankroll, you know, for-profit private developers. So we won hard investment up front, and you know, arguably we had some impact on the tax increment grant plan that followed. But yeah, anyway, so that's where we landed on it. And I see a hand in back.
Yeah, early in your conversation, you said something about Cary being at a point where he had a choice to become sort of a luxury gated community or a diverse community. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I don't see a luxury community surviving without a strong service industry population residing within it, right? So, like, how do we change that story, or what is One Wake doing to communicate that what's bringing these big companies here is good schools, great restaurants, fun things to do, good healthcare, all of that takes a middle class that's strong and thriving.
That's right. That's right. So in the larger picture, I mean, I think we're arguing for. Our argument is that with more voices at the table, a larger understanding of the town's own self-interest can be reached, and issues like what you've just lifted up can become more obvious. So if the only interests around the table are developers or corporations looking to relocate, or very wealthy Cary residents who may just be looking for that country club experience, then we're going to miss some very obvious facts. If nobody who keeps our restaurants working, our hospitals running, who works in the fire departments or for the public transit system, if nobody can afford to live in Cary anymore, the town's going to find it harder and harder to keep functioning. And eventually it's going to find itself in the unenviable position of having to compete with other towns and cities that are more affordable and have the same kind of jobs. If you go to Chapel Hill, part of the Orange County organization where I've been for 6 years before that, you can see what that problem looks like firsthand. Left unchecked, it's very hard to hire and retain workers who are willing to drive all the way from their affordable community to Chapel Hill, while they have to, on a route that takes them past several more, affordable communities that they could live and work and thrive in. When it snows too much, the bus system shuts down because the bus drivers can't make the trip from Roxborough, where they live, to Chapel Hill to drive the buses because all the country roads are frozen over. I mean, at a certain point, towns that get too expensive just don't really work as well as they could. There's a larger self-interest here beyond just what's right. If we take that problem and break it down, something that we have a lot of say in as citizens in this town locally is where public investment is directed or not. So one tangible way that we can work on that issue is by taking a hard look at Cary's budget. And, good for Cary, that's a nice, healthy budget. Again, I mean, not to knock Chapel Hill too much while I'm up here, but, you see a town, I mean, they'll never admit it, but they're broke. They got no industry. Their largest employer is a nonprofit university. Good luck with that. Cary, man, you've got a very healthy budget. The question is, what do we use that budget for? Obviously, the town has priorities around parks, recreation, keeping taxes low generally. Cary has the lowest tax rate in Wake County. That's all good. But what else? What else could that budget be used for to address the fact that this town is becoming increasingly exclusive and unaffordable? I mean, that's part of where our argument for this local designated housing fund has come from. That if we reorganize a relatively modest percentage of the budget, we can take the first step forward in terms of actually putting money on the table to preventing this town from turning into a gated community, with essential workers driving in 45 minutes to an hour from Johnston County or Siler City or wherever it is that's still affordable.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Any other questions in the room? Okay, Pastor Wolfgang?
Oh, well, as Pastor Wolfgang comes up here, here's my big finish.
Make it quick. Some of us have to do church again in 10 minutes.
Here's my 60-second crescendo. It's not enough to know what's happening in our town. It's also about having the power necessary to change the problems that we see. The danger of prophecy without power is just becoming like a Cassandra, right? Knowing what's going to happen, but having nobody take us seriously. One Wake serves to build power behind prophecy so that we can get in front of the problems we see facing our town and make the changes necessary to make Cary more as it should be, in line with our values and traditions. And if you're at all interested in this work, I'd ask you to hold the date of March 31st, 7:30 p.m. For a One Wake Cary-wide town meeting to hear where we stand on this affordable housing fund and to propose a strategy for the second half of the spring to make sure that Cary's budget reflects what we want to see happen in our communities.
All right.
That's my big ending.
Thank you.
Pass it off
Thank
to
you
you,
so
Pastor.
much, Devin, for being here and telling us more about One Wake. It's a very important ministry to us. And thank you all for being here, whether you're in the room or at home on Facebook or YouTube. I appreciate you being here for this important topic, and we'll continue or conclude with this prayer for the human family. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred that infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and through our struggle and confusion, work to accomplish your purposes on earth, so that in your good time, every people and nation may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord, let the people of God say, Amen.
Okay, and as we leave, just a quick word. Next Sunday is the last in this series, and we're going to be talking about the gift of hospitality and some important work being done in our community around that issue. So, hope you come back. Thank you.